The air was thick with the scent of war and the weight of destiny. In the year 330 BCE, one man's betrayal would forever etch his name into history, not as a hero, but as a symbol of the harsh consequences of defying the great Alexander the Great. What would drive a man to turn against one of the most brilliant military minds in history, a ruler whose conquests stretched from Greece to India? And more importantly, what would be the price for that betrayal? The answer is chilling, a brutal tale of impalement and the end of a life that could have been greater than most. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking story of how Alexander's closest ally became his most infamous traitor. The rise of Parmenion, a trusted general. Parmenion, the seasoned and wise general of Alexander's army, was a man who had earned Alexander's complete trust. He wasn't just another soldier. He was the backbone of Alexander's early victories. As the commander of the left wing of the Macedonian army, Parmenion's tactics and strategic brilliance were integral to the expansion of Alexander's empire. His loyalty to the young king was unquestionable, and together, they carved out a new world. But as history has shown, even the most trusted individuals can falter when faced with temptation, fear, or ambition. Betrayal looms. The whisper of conspiracy Parmenion. His story takes a dark turn when he became embroiled in a web of conspiracy. As Alexander's empire grew, so did the threats to his power, both from within and from without. A traitor named Philotas, Parmenion's son, was accused of conspiring to assassinate Alexander. The whispers of this treason quickly reached the ears of the king, who, despite the shock of the accusation, had no choice but to act. Philotas was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. But the fallout from his son's betrayal would lead Alexander to make one of the most difficult decisions of his life. Parmenion's dark decision. Now, with the death of his son, Parmenion found himself at a crossroads. The loyal general faced an unbearable dilemma. Could he remain loyal to a king who had executed his flesh and blood? Or would he too fall victim to the same fate? The tension was palpable. As a form of revenge, and whispers spread like wildfire through the ranks of Alexander's army. Some say Parmenion harbored a deep resentment against the young king, while others argue that he had no choice but to plot against him for the death of his son. What is certain is that Parmenion's betrayal was imminent, and it would change the course of history. The betrayal unfolds. As the events unfolded, the plot against Alexander began to take shape. Parmenion, once a trusted ally, now found himself in league with those who sought to bring down the king. His rebellion, however, was not to be a quiet, covert affair. It would be a betrayal that reverberated across the empire. He conspired with the enemies of Alexander and attempted to turn his soldiers against him. What drove Parmenion to make such a drastic decision? Was it the loss of his son, the fear of losing his power, or something even darker that lurked in his heart? The shocking consequences. The end of Parmenion. When Alexander discovered the plot, his wrath was swift and unforgiving. There was no room for mercy in his world, especially not for someone who had once been his closest ally. Parmenion's fate was sealed, and it was a cruel one. In a brutal display of power and authority, Alexander ordered Parmenion's death. But this wasn't a simple execution, it was a horrific punishment that would forever cement the betrayal in the annals of history. Parmenion, the man who had once stood by Alexander's side in triumph, was impaled alive. The very image of a man, once powerful and revered, now suffering such a fate, is enough to send chills down anyone's spine. This gruesome execution wasn't just about punishing a traitor, it was a message. It was a warning to anyone who might consider betraying Alexander the Great, or anyone who dared to question his rule. The execution of Parmenion was not just a personal vendetta, it was a political statement, one that sent a clear message to the rest of the empire. Betrayal, no matter the cost, would not be tolerated. The death of Parmenion was a turning point for Alexander the Great. It wasn't just a military action. It was a personal betrayal that cut to the core of Alexander's inner circle. The king had already conquered vast territories and faced countless battles, but no adversary, no matter how formidable, could have prepared him for the betrayal of someone he had trusted as a father. With the execution of Parmenion, Alexander did not merely eliminate a traitor, he eradicated the last remaining ties of loyalty within his ranks. What followed was the inevitable transformation of Alexander's leadership and empire. The fear that spread among the ranks. In the aftermath of Parmenion's execution, an air of fear began to permeate the Macedonian army. Soldiers who had once looked up to the great general and trusted his word now questioned the stability of their own positions. How far would Alexander go to protect his throne? Would he now turn on those who had stood by him for years? The fear was palpable, not just among the lower ranks, but among the generals and commanders who had once fought alongside Alexander. The tension was thick, and whispers of distrust spread like wildfire. Parmenion had been the trusted military mind behind many of Alexander's most significant victories. His loss, although necessary in Alexander's eyes, was a blow to the very foundation of his army's morale. It was one thing to punish a traitor, but it was another to lose a man who had been essential to the king's rise. With Parmenion's death, Alexander was forced to make difficult decisions. Who could he trust now? Who would be willing to risk everything to follow a king who had shown such ruthless vengeance? A king transformed. Alexander's changing nature. Before the death of Parmenion, Alexander had been a leader who inspired loyalty through admiration and respect. He had been seen as a visionary, a conqueror who promised glory, wealth, and power to his men. But the betrayal of Parmenion marked a shift in Alexander's leadership. No longer was he merely a conqueror. He became a ruler driven by an iron will, one who would brook no defiance. His earlier, more humanistic approach to leadership gave way to a much more tyrannical mindset. Alexander's decision to execute Parmenion, despite their long-standing friendship, revealed a side of the king that was unrecognizable to many. His legendary charisma, which had once captivated allies and enemies alike, was now shadowed by a cold and calculating desire for control. The fear of betrayal would become a constant undercurrent in his rule. What had been a bond of loyalty between a king and his general was now a tragic lesson in the price of disloyalty. The reaction in Persia, an empire in chaos. As news of Parmenion's execution spread, it reached the ears of Alexander's enemies, particularly in Persia, where Darius III, the Persian king, had been keeping a close eye on the growing threat of the Macedonian king. The death of Parmenion was a significant event in the broader scope of Alexander's conquest. It sent a ripple effect throughout the Persian Empire, leaving Darius and his generals to question the strength of Alexander's command. They were not merely facing a military powerhouse, they were up against a king whose ruthlessness knew no bounds. Yet, Alexander's internal turmoil and the increasingly iron-fisted rule he adopted would not have gone unnoticed by his enemies. While many feared the military genius of Alexander, others saw his obsession with control as a potential weakness. By executing a man of Parmenion's stature, Alexander made it clear that he would sacrifice even his closest allies if they threatened his power. To those who were still loyal to him, this was a display of his unyielding power, but to his enemies, it was an opportunity to exploit the cracks in his empire. The legacy of Parmenion's betrayal. Despite the fear it instilled among his followers, Parmenion's death would not be the last act of betrayal Alexander would face. The aftermath of the general's execution also set the stage for future conspiracies and struggles for power within Alexander's ranks. Alexander's obsession with securing his reign and eliminating potential threats would lead to a reign of paranoia and suspicion. His inner circle grew smaller and smaller, and trust became an increasingly rare commodity. Parmenion's betrayal also led to a philosophical shift in Alexander's view of power. He had once trusted that loyalty could be built through respect and admiration, but his experience with betrayal taught him that loyalty could be more effectively enforced through fear. This new understanding of power would influence how he governed his empire from that point onward. While Alexander's military campaigns continued to make him a legendary figure in history, his leadership became more centralized, and his empire, while vast, would be built on the foundation of fear rather than camaraderie. The final legacy, a kingdom built on fear and power. By the time of his death in 323 BCE, Alexander had built one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, spanning from Greece to India. Yet, the cost of maintaining such an empire was high. The paranoia, distrust, and betrayal that marked his later years left a dark shadow over his legacy. His empire, though powerful, was fragile, and it began to fragment soon after his death, as his generals and satraps vied for control over the territories he had conquered. The fear and suspicion that Alexander fostered throughout his reign continued to haunt the empire long after his passing. In the end, Alexander the Great's legacy was not just one of military genius, but also one of cautionary tales of betrayal, power, and the unrelenting desire to control one's destiny at any cost. Parmenion's betrayal and its consequences served as a stark reminder of the dangers of trusting too easily and of the unforgiving nature of the ancient world. Alexander, for all his greatness, paid a heavy price for the betrayal of his once loyal general. And in that betrayal, he forged a lesson in power that would echo through the centuries. No one is truly safe from the reach of a king who rules through fear.